The house had stood in the Hollywood Hills for decades, a modern yet timeless estate with sweeping views of Los Angeles. It was the kind of place only a filmmaker like Norman Jewison could have owned, a home filled with stories, history, and perhaps something more. After Jewison's passing in 2022, the property was sold to a young couple, Daniel and Sarah Whitmore, tech entrepreneurs who had made their fortune with a Silicon Valley startup. They weren't the type to believe in ghosts. Rational, analytical, and ambitious, they had chosen the house not for its history, but for its beauty. But the house had its own plans. It started subtly, a faint scent of cigar smoke in the study, though neither of them smoked. The room had been Jewison's sanctuary, where he read scripts and edited films, and though the new owners had remodeled the space, the air still carried the ghost of the past. Then came the music. Late at night, the sound of a faint piano echoed through the halls, even though there was no piano in the house. At first, Daniel assumed it was a neighbor, but the melody, soft, melancholic, seemed to come from within their own walls. Sarah noticed the cold spots, especially near the grand fireplace. A chill would settle over her whenever she walked past, even when the fire was roaring. And then, there were the shadows just at the edge of their vision, vanishing the moment they turned their heads. The Whitmores dismissed it all as coincidence until the night Daniel stayed up late working in the study. He had been reading an article about Norman Jewison's career when the lights flickered. The room went dark for a moment, and when the glow of his laptop returned, something had changed. On the bookshelf, one book had fallen, a thick biography of the director, lying open to a page about in the heat of the night. A chill ran down his spine as he read about how Jewison had fought for social justice in his films, always pushing boundaries. And then a whisper, soft, barely audible, a single word, action. Daniel froze. The room was empty, and yet, the air felt heavy, charged with something unseen. He closed his laptop and left the study, locking the door behind him. Over the next few weeks, the disturbances intensified. Lights turned on and off by themselves. Footsteps echoed in the hallways when no one was there. One night, Sarah awoke to find the TV playing an old interview with Jewison, except the remote was on the nightstand, untouched. They called in an expert, a paranormal investigator who had worked on cases across Hollywood. She walked through the house, pausing at the study. "He's still here," she murmured. "But he's not trapped. He just isn't finished." That night, Daniel and Sarah made a decision. They had bought the house for its aesthetic, but they now realized it was more than a home. It was a monument to a life's work. Instead of ignoring the presence, they embraced it. They restored the study to how it had been during Jewison's time. They placed his films in a display case. And finally, they brought in a vintage piano. The music never played mysteriously again. The cold spots faded. The house, once restless, now felt at peace. Maybe Norman had just needed to know his legacy was safe. And once he did, he finally called cut. The house settled into an uneasy quiet. The Whitmores no longer heard the phantom piano, nor did they wake to flickering lights or whispered words in the night. Yet, there remained a feeling, something just beneath the surface of their reality, lingering like a thread left untied. The air in certain rooms still carried a weight, not oppressive, but watchful, as if the walls themselves were waiting for something. Daniel, ever the rationalist, convinced himself that their tribute to Jewison had put whatever restless energy resided in the house at ease. He spent more time in the study now, where the faint scent of old paper and wood polish mixed with something less tangible, something that felt like memory. He would run his fingers along the spines of books Jewison had once owned, sometimes stopping on one by instinct alone, as if it had been waiting for him. Sarah, on the other hand, found herself drawn to the edges of the house, the hallways, the grand staircase, the terrace overlooking the city. She had never been superstitious before, but in this house, she couldn't ignore the way certain spaces made her feel. The staircase in particular unsettled her, though she could never say why. It was just a staircase, sleek and modern, cutting through the house like a ribbon of black marble. And yet, sometimes, as she descended it in the evening, she felt as though she weren't alone. A movement, glimpsed from the corner of her eye. A figure, perhaps, standing in the periphery of her vision, always gone when she turned to look. One night, when the city was drowned in a thick fog rolling up from the valley, Sarah stood by the terrace doors, watching the way the mist swallowed the distant lights. The house behind her was dark except for the warm glow from the study, where Daniel sat reading. She let her fingers rest against the cold glass of the doors, lost in thought. And then, a sound. Not the piano, not footsteps, something softer, more distant, yet impossibly close. A sigh, almost imperceptible, but enough to send a chill racing down her spine. She turned, expecting to see Daniel in the doorway, but the hallway was empty. The silence pressed in around her, thick and waiting. Slowly, she stepped back into the house, her bare feet making no sound against the polished floor. The shadows in the hallway stretched long, twisting in the dim light. She exhaled, forcing a nervous laugh. "Just my imagination," she murmured. But as she turned away, she could have sworn she heard another whisper. Not words this time, just the faintest intake of breath, like someone standing too close in the dark. "Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story." The whisper was gone as soon as it had come, swallowed by the vast silence of the house. Sarah stood frozen for a moment longer, her pulse a slow, heavy drum against her ribs. Then, with a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, she turned away, rubbing her arms as if shaking off the cold that had crept beneath her skin. She told herself it was nothing. A trick of the house, the way large spaces could breathe and settle like living things. But as she made her way down the long hallway, past the darkened rooms and the looming staircase, a sensation followed her, something just behind her shoulder, brushing against the edge of her awareness. It wasn't a presence, not exactly. More like the residue of one, like an afterimage burned into her vision even after she had closed her eyes. The study was still lit when she entered. Daniel sat in the leather armchair, a book resting against his knee, his expression lost in thought. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long, flickering shadows along the walls, and the scent of aged wood and something faintly metallic, perhaps the old brass fixtures, lingered in the air. Sarah hesitated in the doorway, watching him, her earlier unease still clinging to her. She wanted to tell him what had happened, but as she opened her mouth, the words felt insubstantial, flimsy. What would she even say? That she had felt something? That she had heard a breath in an empty room? Instead, she simply said, "Still reading?" Daniel glanced up, his eyes adjusting to her presence as if pulled from somewhere far away. He lifted the book slightly, showing her the worn cover. The Art of Storytelling, a relic from the house's past, one of the many books that had belonged to Jewison himself. "I keep finding things in here," he said, flipping a page, though his tone was absent-minded. "Little notes in the margins. His handwriting, I think." Sarah stepped closer, looking over his shoulder. The pages were yellowed, the ink faded but still legible. "Character is revealed in silence, not in speech." The words were underlined in a sharp, decisive stroke. Sarah frowned. "That's interesting." Daniel tapped the page lightly with his thumb. "It is, isn't it?" Then, after a pause, "I think he used this as a kind of workbook. There are notes all over." Sarah glanced at the open page again, her fingers brushing against the edge of the paper. The ink seemed older than it should have been, almost sunken into the fibers, as though it had always been part of the book. A small, inexplicable shiver ran down her spine, but she ignored it. Outside, the wind stirred through the trees, whispering through the branches like a secret just beyond comprehension. Over the next few weeks, Sarah tried to push the strange moment from her mind. The house was just that, a house. The air inside it did not breathe. The walls did not watch. The whispers she thought she had heard were nothing more than the shifting of an old building settling into its bones. And yet the feeling persisted. It came when she moved through the dim hallways late at night, her footsteps impossibly loud against the marble floors. It clung to her in the moments just before sleep, when the silence became too thick, too expectant. It crept in during the in-between spaces, the pause between flicking a light switch and the bulb igniting, the fraction of a second between stepping into a room and fully registering its emptiness. She didn't tell Daniel. He had become more and more engrossed in the books left behind, spending long hours in the study. Sometimes, she would come in to find him hunched over a notebook, scribbling down lines as if taking dictation. She would tease him about it, but he would only smile, distracted, and say, "There's something about this place. It makes you want to create." It should have been comforting. It wasn't. Then, one evening, something changed. Sarah was in the bedroom, brushing her hair in front of the antique vanity that had come with the house. The mirror was large, its glass slightly warped with age, the gold frame elegant but heavy, like something out of a dream. She wasn't looking at her reflection. Not really, her mind was elsewhere, lost in the idle motions of routine. But then, a flicker, a movement behind her. She stopped, the brush stilled in her hand. Slowly, her eyes lifted, meeting her own gaze in the mirror. The room behind her was empty, but she had seen it. She knew she had seen it. A shape just at the edge of the reflection, just behind her shoulder. She turned sharply. Nothing. Her breath came quicker now, shallow, her skin cold. She turned back to the mirror. The room looked the same. The bed neatly made. The curtains drawn back to reveal the night beyond. The lamp beside her casting a warm, golden glow. But there was something different, something she couldn't name. Then she saw it. The closet door. It was open. Just slightly. She didn't remember leaving it open. She was sure she hadn't. A soft creak echoed through the room. Sarah's fingers clenched around the wooden handle of the hairbrush, her pulse hammering against her throat. Slowly, she stood, turning toward the dark sliver of space behind the closet door. The air inside felt thick, heavier than it should have been. And then so soft she almost didn't hear it. A whisper. This time it was a word. A single, unmistakable word. Cut. The word slithered through the air like a breath exhaled too close to her ear, as if someone stood right behind her, lips parting just enough to let the sound slip through. Sarah went rigid. The brush in her hand felt suddenly foreign, like an object from another world, something that did not belong in the suffocating hush of this room. She swallowed hard. Her gaze remained fixed on the sliver of darkness beyond the closet door, where the faint scent of cedar and old fabric hung in the air. Her pulse pounded in her ears, filling the silence with a dull, thrumming pressure. Had she imagined it? She wanted to believe she had. But the room felt different now, thick with something unseen, something waiting. And then the door moved. Not much, just a fraction of an inch. A shift so subtle it could have been dismissed as settling wood or an air current, if not for the way it happened slowly, deliberately, as if someone had pushed from the inside. Sarah's breath hitched in her throat. She took a step back, her knees stiff, her fingers tightening around the brush handle until her knuckles ached. The air pressed against her skin, cold and unrelenting. And then the lamp flickered, just once. A brief, stuttering hesitation in the glow. Her mind screamed at her to move, to leave, to run. But her body stayed frozen, caught between disbelief and something deeper, an unspoken understanding that she had crossed an invisible threshold. This house, with its elegant hallways and its perfect, curated beauty, was not empty. She took a breath, steadying herself. One step forward. Another. She reached out, fingers trembling as they brushed against the closet door. The wood was cool beneath her touch. She pushed. The door swung open, revealing nothing but neatly arranged clothes, Daniel's jackets, her dresses, the familiar folds of fabric untouched and undisturbed. The scent of worn leather and old perfume drifted outward, a familiar, grounding smell. But there was something else. A book. It lay on the floor of the closet, as if it had fallen there long ago and been forgotten. She hesitated, then crouched slowly, her pulse still erratic as she reached for it. The cover was smooth beneath her fingertips, the deep blue binding worn at the edges. She turned it over in her hands, frowning as she read the title. The director's notebook. It was one of Jewison's. She had seen it before on the bookshelf in the study. She was sure of it. Her heart hammered. She stood, gripping the book tightly, and left the room without looking back. Daniel was still in the study, bathed in the golden glow of the desk lamp. The fire had burned down to embers now, the shadows on the walls deep and flickering. Sarah stepped inside, the book pressed against her chest. "Daniel!" Her voice was thin, barely more than a whisper. He looked up, eyes unfocused at first, then sharpening as they landed on her. "What's wrong?" She held up the book. His brow furrowed. "Where did you get that?" "In our closet," she said. "On the floor." Daniel frowned. "That's impossible. I just put it back on the shelf an hour ago." Sarah's fingers tightened around the book's spine. The silence stretched between them, long and uneasy. Then, the fire crackled, sending a shower of tiny sparks into the air. And from somewhere deep in the house, faint, distant, but unmistakable, came the sound of a door closing. The sound rippled through the house like a distant echo, soft but deliberate, as if someone had moved with careful intent. Both Sarah and Daniel froze. The study was warm, the fire casting golden light against the bookshelves, but the air around them had shifted, subtly yet unmistakably. It was heavier now, charged with something unseen but undeniable. Sarah clutched the book tighter. The cover felt worn and smooth beneath her fingers, the pages inside whisper-thin and fragile with age. "You heard that," she said, though it wasn't really a question. Daniel hesitated for only a moment before nodding. He placed his own book aside, standing slowly, as if any sudden movement might disturb whatever had just settled over the house. His gaze flicked toward the dark hallway beyond the study door. "The bedroom?" he asked. Sarah swallowed. The noise had come from that direction. They moved together, silent except for the muffled sound of their footsteps against the floor. The house was vast, yet at this moment it felt smaller, its walls pressing inward, its corridors stretching longer than they should have. When they reached the bedroom, the door was ajar. Sarah hesitated, her fingers hovering near the edge of the frame. The closet door stood exactly as she had left it, yawning open to reveal its harmless, neatly hung contents. But something was different. Daniel reached for the light switch and flicked it on. The chandelier overhead flared to life, washing the room in its soft glow. At first glance, nothing seemed out of place. The bed was still made, the curtains undisturbed, the vanity mirror reflecting only their own wary faces. And then Sarah saw it. The nightstand drawer. It was open, not fully, just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness inside. She turned to Daniel. "Did you leave that open?" He shook his head, his eyes locked on the drawer. A prickling sensation crawled up Sarah's spine. She stepped forward, pulse hammering in her throat, and reached out. The drawer slid open smoothly beneath her touch, revealing its contents, her usual belongings. A few books, an old journal, a couple of stray hair ties, and something else. Piece of paper, folded neatly, placed directly on top of everything else, as though someone had left it there to be found. Sarah hesitated before picking it up. The paper was smooth, thick, its edges slightly yellowed. She unfolded it carefully, her breath catching in her throat as she recognized the handwriting. The ink was faded, the letters flowing in an elegant, precise script. "The final shot is the most important. It lingers in the mind. It must say everything." Sarah's hands trembled. "It's his," she murmured. "It's Jewison's." Daniel leaned over her shoulder, his expression unreadable. "How the hell did this get in here?" Sarah's mouth felt dry. The book in her other hand, the one she had found in the closet, suddenly felt heavier. A new thought took shape, slow and chilling. "What if," she whispered, "he's not just lingering?" Daniel turned to her, frowning. "What do you mean?" Sarah stared down at the note, at the words written in careful, deliberate strokes. "What if he's directing?" That night, sleep did not come easily. Sarah lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind circling the same uneasy thoughts. The note, the book, the whispers in the dark, none of it could be explained. Not rationally. Daniel had tried. He had gone back to the study, scoured the bookshelves, convinced himself that the note had simply been misplaced somehow, that the book had fallen from its place before she found it. But there had been no other papers like it, no other signs of anything out of place. And yet, something in the house had shifted. The silence no longer felt empty, felt like a pause, like an inhale before the next line of dialogue. Sarah turned onto her side, watching the soft glow of the city lights spill through the curtains. The bed felt vast and cold, despite Daniel's presence beside her. Then, deep in the house, something creaked. A floorboard. Sarah's breath hitched. She strained her ears, listening. The sound had come from beyond their bedroom down the hall. It had been slow, deliberate, not the random settling of an old house, not a sound easily dismissed. Another step, then another, moving toward them. Sarah's hand gripped Daniel's beneath the covers. His fingers curled instinctively around hers, but he did not wake. His breath remained steady, undisturbed. Sarah turned her head toward the bedroom door. The space beneath it was a thin strip of darkness, unbroken. Nothing moved, but she felt it, something just beyond the threshold. Waiting. The air in the room was suddenly colder, pressing against her skin in a way that made her shudder. The presence wasn't threatening, not exactly, but it was deliberate. It was expectant. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to sleep, to ignore the heavy silence, the waiting hush of the house. And then, just as she began to drift, a voice, low, soft, so close it could have been inside her own mind. Rolling. Sarah's eyes flew open. The room was silent, but the words still lingered, curling in the air like the last flicker of a dying ember. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she turned toward the bedroom door. Her breath caught somewhere between fear and realization. The house wasn't haunted. It was alive. Something unseen was moving the pieces into place, setting the stage, directing each moment with meticulous precision. She sat up, her body rigid with tension. But before she could wake Daniel, the bedside lamp flickered. The light dimmed once, twice, then steadied. The shadows in the room stretched unnaturally long. Then, from the hallway, the softest sound. A door clicking shut. Sarah held her breath. Whatever had been watching, waiting, guiding it had just given its signal. The scene was set, and somewhere in the depths of the house, unseen hands were calling. Action. Don't forget to subscribe and like if you liked this story.